Hi, so this is going to be kind of a Q&A thing. Someone asked me in the comments of one of my videos if I could do a video on some basic music theory using the Deluge. They came up with some really good questions, so I thought I'm just going to try to answer them using the Deluge and no piano and no guitar. Before I get to answering those questions, I'm going to answer a couple of questions I came up with myself, a couple of even more basic ones. So I'm going to start with, what's an interval? Well, an interval is just the distance between two notes. Of course, there's a little bit more to it because it can't just be any distance. In Western music, we divide an octave into 12 slices. These slices we call semitones. A semitone then is the smallest possible distance between two notes. Now let's have a look at this on the Deluge. With the scale mode on, we only get to see the notes of a major scale. And these lit pads on the right side here tell us where an octave is. If I turn the scale mode off now, we get to see all 12 semitones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then it starts over again. Now the word octave kind of carries the Latin word for 8 in it, and a octave is 12 semitones. So what's that all about? When we're actually making music, most of the time we don't use all of those 12 semitones, but only a scale with 8 notes, like a major scale, for example. So that's where that 8 in octave comes from. So when I turn the scale mode back on the Deluge, this is exactly what we're getting, a major scale from here to here. So now from one lit pad to the next, or from one octave to the next, it's not 12 pads anymore, it's only 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Maybe note here it's 8 with the octave, while it's 12 semitones without the octave, so it's actually a scale of just 7 notes. This is where the names of the intervals, the ones we usually use, like a second and a third and a fourth and so on, come from. So a third is the third note in a major scale. The fourth is the fourth note in a major scale. The fifth is the fifth note in a major scale, and so on. Now there are also some minor versions of some of these intervals. So to get to a minor third, for example, you only go half the distance from the second note to the third note, or half a step. I'm guessing that's where the term semitone comes from. So when I turn the scale mode on the Deluge back off, we can see that there's some more notes which we didn't get to see before. They're always there, but the scale mode masks them somehow, so we only get the ones that are in the scale that we want. The pattern of lit and dark pads that we get here is exactly what we get on a piano with the white and the black keys. So it's really tempting to show a piano here, but I'm not gonna. The lit pads would be the white keys, and the dark pads would be the black keys. So if I were to change this third note to only half the distance from here to here, what I'm getting is a minor third. Same thing, for example, with this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th note. This would be a minor sixth. There are minor seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. But the octave, fourth, fifth, and perfect unison are not called major and minor. They're called perfect or diminished or augmented. I don't want to get into why right now, but just take note of that. So we're dealing with two sets of numbers here, 12 for the semitones and 8 with some half steps in between for the interval names. I think this can be kind of confusing, so make sure not to mix them up. Each interval can be described as a multiple of semitones. So here's an overview. By the way, there are no laws of physics that tell us to divide an octave into 12 semitones. It just gets us really close to some really nice sounding notes. So we just do it for the purpose of music making. If you were to invent a piano, for example, you just kind of have to decide into how many keys you want to divide an octave. So next question, what's a chord? This is a pretty simple one. A chord is just 3 or more notes played simultaneously. Usually by a chord we mean a set of notes which actually sounds nice together, and in Western music the most common type of chord is a triad. In this video I will exclusively talk about triad, so whenever I say chord I mean triad by that. So what's a triad? A triad is a set of notes which can be stacked vertically in thirds. So this is why it's important that you know what a third is. With the scale mode on the Deluge, it's super easy to see what a third is. You just press a pad, skip a row of pads, press a pad, skip a row of pads, press a pad, and there's your triad. Now there's some different kinds of triads, 4 of them to be precise. There's a major chord, a minor chord, a diminished chord, and an augmented chord. There's 4 of them because we have 2 different kinds of thirds, and they're made up of different combinations of the 2. With the scale mode on here, it's hard to tell that the interval between the bottom and the top 2 notes are different, but with the scale mode off, it's easy to see that there's 4 semitones between the bottom 2 notes and only 3 between the top 2 notes. This combination of a major third at the bottom and a minor third on top is a major triad. When I move this middle note down by 1 semitone, we get a minor third at the bottom and a major third on top. This is the structure of a minor triad. By moving the top note down 1 semitone, we get 2 minor thirds. This is the structure of a diminished triad. And by building a chord with 2 major thirds, we get an augmented chord. Now, this doesn't fit on the grid, so I'll just hit play. So let's recap. A major chord is a minor third stacked on top a major third. A minor chord is a major third stacked on top of a minor third. A diminished chord is 2 stacked minor thirds, and an augmented chord is 2 stacked major thirds. Major and minor are a lot more common than diminished and augmented ones, because the combination of a major and minor third, regardless of their order, is going to lead to a perfect fifth, which is a very nice sounding interval. It's important to keep in mind that with a scale mode on, we automatically get a different type of triad depending on where we start stacking our thirds. But this already brings me to my next question. What do the Roman numerals mean that we use to describe chord progressions? So 1, 5, 6, 4, for example. What does that mean? Well, the Roman numeral points to the degree of a scale where we start stacking our thirds. So for example, if we stack a couple of thirds onto the 3rd note of a major scale, we get to a 3 chord. Now remember the 4 different types of triads I told you about earlier. Depending on what note we start stacking our thirds on, we get a different type of triad. So for example, on the 3rd note of the major scale, we get a minor chord. Let's double check. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. Sometimes you see a little minus sign behind the chord that tells us that we're dealing with a minor chord. So in this case, the correct symbol for the 3 chord would be 3 minus. If we start stacking our notes on the 4th note of a major scale, we get a major chord again. Let's have a look at it in semitones here as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. If we start stacking our thirds on the 7th note of a major scale, this is the only place where we're going to get a diminished chord. So let's have a look at this without scale mode as well. We can see it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2 minor thirds. We never ever get an augmented chord by stacking notes within the major scale. If we use a different scale as a starting point, we might get an augmented chord or triad, and it's just good to know that it also exists. Sometimes you see a little minus sign behind a Roman numeral that tells you that you're dealing with a minor chord. For a major chord, we don't have any specific sign to tell you that it is a major chord. For a diminished chord, you put a little circle behind the Roman numeral, and for an augmented chord, a plus sign. So next I'm going to try to put together that 1, 5, 6, 4 chord progression which popped up in the question. So for this I will have to start on the 1st note of a major scale first and stack some thirds, and then I'm going to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th note, stacking a couple of thirds here, and the next one's going to be 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Building a triad on the 6th note of the major scale, and the last one's going to be 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and another triad here. Let's listen to this. So this is what the Roman numerals mean. Now think back again to the different types of triads. If you're wondering what kind of triads you're dealing with here, you can see I put a minus sign behind the 6, so that's probably a minor chord. But to be sure, we can do the same thing here and just go out of the scale mode and check what kinds of thirds we're getting by simply again counting the semitones. So 1, 2, 3, 4 is a major third, 1, 2, 3 a minor third, so this is a major chord. Then the next one looks the same. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. So again, this is a major chord. Now the 6, as expected, is different. 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a minor chord. And then the last one again is a major third at the bottom and a minor third on top, so this is a major chord. Repetition is never a bad thing, so here one more time. The only place where I'm getting neither a major nor a minor chord, but a diminished one, is starting on the 7th note of a major scale. Let's have a look at this too. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2 minor thirds, a diminished chord. Here's another interesting question. Which note or notes do I have to move to get to a reasonable next chord? To answer this, we have to talk about what chord inversions are real quick. When we simply stack 2/3 on top of a root note, what we get is called a close root position. Close because the notes are as close together as possible, and root because the root is at the bottom and then the other 2 notes on top of it. If we arrange the same 3 notes differently, we still get the same chord, but a different inversion. By moving the root note up 1 octave, we get to the first inversion. Now it's still close position because they're still as close together as possible, but now the third is at the bottom and not the root anymore. If we repeat the same process and move the third up 1 octave as well, we get to the second inversion. Now the 5th is at the bottom. Now if we go back to the original close root position and move the middle note up 1 octave, we're not getting a different inversion because the lowest note remains unchanged. It's still in root position because the root is still at the bottom, but it's not close anymore because they're not as close together as possible. Now we have a gap in between the root and the 5th. That's why it is called open position. This, by the way, can mean many things. If we move it up by 3 octaves, it's still open position. It doesn't necessarily have to be just one gap in there. So here's a quick recap. The bottom note determines the inversion. Root note at the bottom, root position. Third at the bottom, first inversion. 5th at the bottom, second inversion. So what's this got to do with moving one note to get from one chord to another? Well, let's say we have a 1 chord in root position, and if we move the top note, which is the 5th, up by 1 whole tone, we get to the first inversion of the 6th chord. So this is why we don't have to move all of the notes to get from one chord to another. I'll turn this into a 4-bar chord progression now. First, I'll move the middle note up by 1 step to get a second inversion chord, and then for the last one, I'm going to go with a root position chord again by moving up the lowest note by 1 step. So let's have a listen to this as well. Now if you're unsure what these chords are, just put them back into root position by making sure they have the structure of a root position chord. So always 1 gap between the lid pads. I think the best way to go about this is to move notes in octaves by either moving them from the top row to the bottom row or from the bottom row to the top row. Now here you can easily see we've got 1 gap between each lid pad, so this is a root position triad. The last one already is a root position triad. So we can figure out what chords we got here. The first one starts on the 1, second one on the 6, third one on the 4, and the last one on the 2. So the chord progression is 1, 6, 4, 2. It's oftentimes desirable to have as little movement as possible in the individual voices. That's why the inversions oftentimes sound better than all root position chords. I'm going to go back to my example chord progression I used earlier, the 1, 5, 6, 4, and first just enter it the way I did before by first putting in the root notes and then stacking a couple of thirds on top of them, so I have all chords in root position. But then what I'm going to do is just move notes up and down in octaves so I get different inversions and as little movement as possible in the individual voices. So for example, this guy, I'm going to move down 1 octave, the next top note also, and then I could maybe the lowest note of the first chord, move that up 1 octave. So now we have the same chord progression as before, but this time with different inversions. Try to memorize the structures of the different inversions. The first is always a third and then the 4th on top, and the second inversion is a 4th with a 3rd on top, and the root position, you know that, is just a couple of thirds. Now I'm going to go for a different set of inversions by just moving each bottom note up 1 octave. So this gives us a second inversion chord, a root position chord, and a first inversion chord. So here's what that sounds like. Now, next interesting question. With my synth quantized to a scale, can I punch in just any set of notes and it'll sound good? Well, not quite, but the likelihood of something nice happening when you have a scale mode turned on or things quantized to a scale is a lot higher than without it. Also, remember what I told you about triads. If you stick to stacking thirds within a quantized scale, that likelihood even increases further. But let's just try and see what happens if I randomly put in some note and try to give it as little thought as possible. And let's listen to this. Now, as you can hear, this doesn't sound all that bad. And if you stick to triads, you're really very likely to get something good out of this. Now, I'm even putting all the notes in root position triads here. I'm going to change this one because otherwise it's going to be the same as the first one. And then here's our new chord progression. And if you want to mix it up, moving notes around in octaves is always a good place to start. So I'm doing that here. So again, I'm getting some different inversions. Maybe I'll move the bottom note of the first one up again and the top note of the last one down one octave. So this is our new chord progression. Let's maybe try out some open position chords here as well. So I'm going to move the middle notes up one octave for this. Again, just moving notes from the bottom row to the top row. And as long as you're in scale mode, this is going to give you an octave. Open position chords are especially helpful when you have chords in a very low register, because oftentimes notes very close together don't sound good when they're very low. I'll move this down even further so you can hear. There's even a thing called low interval limits, but that's a whole different story for another day. And then, lastly, the most intriguing questions of all of them, I think. Why is 12 semitones an octave and half an octave is 7? Because half of 12 is 6, right? So that's kind of an odd question, because a lot of people wouldn't agree with a fifth being half an octave. But it kind of is. Because if you look at it frequency-wise, let's say you have one note at 440 hertz, the next octave is going to be 880 hertz, and the fifth is going to be smack in the middle at 660 hertz. But it's still kind of not the middle, and that's because we don't hear linearly. I'll try to explain this with a little illustration. So we've got this octave, and we divide it into 12 slices. If we draw a straight line from octave 1 to octave 2, the middle is going to be at 6. But if we use a logarithmic curve to get from point 1 to point 2, we get to slice 7. And that's why it's 7 semitones and not 6. And a fifth is not the middle of an octave or half an octave, at least in the way we perceive it when we hear it. So I really hope I could answer some of those questions in a way that things now make sense. I had fun doing it, and if you have some more questions for me, don't hold back. It's fun to do things like that, and I would look forward to doing something similar in the future again. And until then, thanks a lot for watching. Bye-bye.